What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever been in a room where the silence itself feels alive, where the weight of unspoken words presses down harder than any shout? That was the atmosphere inside Windsor Castle the moment Princess and caught Harry bent over those sacred documents. But the story doesn't begin and end with that confrontation. To truly understand the gravity, we need to rewind, to examine why Harry was even near the will in the first place. Because nothing in the royal family happens by accident. Every move, every glance, every whispered word has history carved into it. And Harry's actions that night didn't appear out of thin air. They were born of years of resentment, financial uncertainty, and a battle between blood and loyalty. Why was Harry so drawn to that well? Was it greed? Fear? A desperate attempt to control his narrative before the monarchy sealed his fate forever? Let's peel back the curtain. For centuries, the wills of monarchs have been closely guarded secrets. Ordinary people's wills are public record, scrutinized and picked apart in courtrooms. But when you are a sovereign, your last wishes are locked away, hidden from the eyes of the world. They are sealed by law, kept in a special archive, so that scandal, favoritism, or shameful revelations never leak into public discourse. The Queen's will was no different. Rumor had it, even within the palace walls, that Elizabeth II's final words contained provisions that would shock not only her children but the entire institution. Imagine the pressure of that secrecy. Imagine knowing your name, your family, your legacy could be buried or immortalized in a single line of text, and that you might never even see it. Harry knew this, and perhaps that knowledge gnawed at him. But let's add another layer. Harry's financial world had been crumbling since his so-called freedom from the royal family. Yes, there were multi-million-dollar deals, Netflix contracts, memoirs. But behind the glamour was a man who had burned through allies, credibility, and cash far faster than anyone expected. The illusion of wealth doesn't always equal security. If the Queen's will left him less than he believed he deserved, or worse, cut him out entirely, that would be devastating. Can you see how desperation begins to take root? Now, the visit itself. Officially, it was framed as reconciliation, a chance for father and son, brother and brother, to finally mend fences. The world's press framed it as historic. A fragile hope dangled before the cameras. Maybe, just maybe, Harry could find his way back into the fold. But what if that wasn't the real reason for his trip? What if reconciliation was a mask, a convenient excuse, while his true mission was to get close enough to those locked chambers where the Queen's legacy slept under seal? Here's the irony. The very palace that he had fled, that he had attacked with words and interviews and memoirs, was also the only place where he could access what he sought. Isn't that the cruel twist of fate? To get what he wanted, he had to return to the place he despised most, to face the family he accused of betrayal, while plotting an act of betrayal himself. Picture it. Harry walking into Windsor, the corridors echoing with history. Every step a reminder of what he once had and what he'd thrown away. Did he feel guilt? Or just determination? Did he wonder if the walls themselves whispered secrets? If the portraits of kings and queens long gone stared him down in judgment? And then there's the question we can't avoid. Was he alone in this plan? Or was Meghan's voice, thousands of miles away in California, echoing in his ear? Critics would argue she was the puppet master, urging him to secure their financial future. Supporters would say she had no hand in it, that Harry acted out of his own wounds. But here's the contradiction that keeps audiences glued to the story. Harry has always insisted he acts for love, for protection, for survival. Yet love and desperation can blur lines, can drive someone to acts they swore they'd never commit. Let's zoom in on the night in question. Hours earlier, Harry had shared a stiff drink with his father. The cameras caught glimpses of strained smiles, of body language so cold it could freeze the air. Behind closed doors, the conversations were brief, the words sharp, the silences heavier than stone. William had been no warmer. He barely acknowledged his younger brother. If Harry had come for reconciliation, it was failing, and perhaps that failure pushed him toward the will with even greater urgency. He waited until the castle settled into silence. The night guards made their rounds. A few lights flickered out, corridors dimmed, the palace slipping into the stillness of sleep. That's when he moved. Not toward William's rooms, not toward Charles, but toward the archives, the chamber where only the closest of aides dared to go. Now ask yourself, how did he get access? A key? A contact? Was someone inside the palace quietly helping him, either out of sympathy or in exchange for favor? Or did Harry exploit his lingering knowledge of Windsor's layout, slipping through doors and corridors as he once had as a child? The questions remain unanswered, but one truth stands. He found his way into the chamber, and he placed himself in front of the Queen's will. Imagine the tension in that moment. His hand hovering over the envelope. His mind racing. Every instinct telling him this was dangerous, wrong, unforgivable. And yet, he did it anyway. He touched it, opened it, scanned the lines. Did he see what he feared? Did he find words that confirmed his exclusion, Meghan's absence, or the stripping of privileges? Whatever he saw, it was enough to keep him frozen there, rifling through pages he had no right to read. And then, footsteps. A shadow in the corridor. A figure moving closer. Harry, head down, didn't notice at first. But the moment that door opened, the moment that voice cut through the silence, everything changed. Princess Anne. Her eyes locked on him, sharp as steel. No hesitation. No confusion. She knew exactly what she was looking at. A grandson bent over the legacy of a grandmother. A man once trusted, now caught in the most damning act of his life. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need theatrics. Her mere presence was thunder enough. Harry froze. His lips parted, searching for an excuse, a justification. But what words could erase what she had just seen? And stepped closer, the silence unbearable. The papers on the desk trembled as his hands shook. Her voice, when it came, was low, controlled, cutting. What did she say? We'll get there. But in that moment, Harry knew the one thing he had feared most had happened. He wasn't alone. He had been caught, and worse. Caught by the one royal least likely to shield him. Because if there is one truth about Princess Anne, it is this: she does not forgive betrayal. And yet, what happened next would drag more than just Harry and into the storm. Because in the stillness of that confrontation, another set of footsteps echoed down the hall. Someone else was about to walk in. And when the door opened again, the very course of the monarchy shifted. But that part of the story is only just beginning. Another set of footsteps echoed down the hall. Whose were they? That's the question that froze both Harry and Princess Anne in place. Imagine it. The tension already unbearable, the air so thick with suspicion you could cut it with a knife. And then, just when you thought things couldn't possibly escalate any further, another shadow stretched across the doorway. The door handle turned. Slowly, deliberately, and in stepped none other than King Charles himself. Now let me ask you, what could be worse for Harry? Being caught by Princess Anne, or being caught by his father, the reigning monarch, the man who had tried, against all odds, to hold this fractured family together? Think about it. To be exposed by and was bad enough, but Charles? That was catastrophic. Because Charles wasn't just his father. He was the king. And tampering with the Queen's will wasn't just family betrayal. It was an act that could be interpreted as an attack on the institution itself. The room went dead silent. Anne's eyes darted to Charles, then back to Harry. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. If anything, her stance grew harder, her expression even more condemning. Harry, on the other hand, was pale, his hands trembling as the papers on the desk seemed to scream louder than any words could. And here's where the contradictions really start to surface. Charles had always been the father who wavered, the one who wanted peace, who longed for unity, who, in his heart, believed his son could be redeemed. He had endured Oprah interviews, Netflix deals, memoirs laced with venom, and yet he still hoped. But now he was staring at his own son hunched over the most sacred document of his mother's reign. What do you say in that moment? Do you shout? Do you collapse into grief? Do you demand answers? Charles, known for his temper but also his hesitance, seemed to do none of those things at first. Instead, he just stood there, watching, his silence louder than any accusation. Let's pause for a second. Imagine yourself in Charles's shoes. Your mother's will, her final words, being pawed over by the very son who had already dragged your family through the mud. What goes through your mind? Is it rage? Betrayal? Or is it heartbreak? The crushing realization that the child you once cradled has crossed a line you can never uncross? And for Harry, what must he have felt? Caught between the stern glare of his aunt and the disbelieving stare of his father. Did he panic? Did he lash out? Did he search for excuses, flimsy as they might be? This is the moment where everything he had built, the victim narrative, the grievances, the distance, collapsed into raw exposure. He wasn't a wronged prince here. He wasn't a misunderstood son. He was a man cornered, caught in an act he couldn't deny, and broke the silence first. Her voice sharp, like the crack of a whip. She said something to Harry, something biting, something that made Charles's face darken. Did she accuse him of theft? Betrayal? Or worse, of dishonoring the queen herself? One thing is certain, her words cut, and they cut deep. Harry stammered. He tried to explain, to justify. Maybe he muttered that he was only checking. Maybe he claimed he was ensuring his wife and children weren't erased. But every word out of his mouth only made it worse. Because in that moment, excuses sounded like confessions. Charles finally spoke, his voice low, heavy with grief. He asked Harry one question. A question that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Was this what his son had become? That's it. Not an accusation. Not a scream. A question. And sometimes, questions hurt more than accusations. The tension escalated further. Harry pleaded, his voice shaking, insisting that he wasn't trying to change anything, only to understand, only to protect. But can you believe that? Can you imagine Charles believing that? After everything, the interviews, the attacks, the betrayal, could he really swallow the idea that this was harmless? And then, another twist. Because as the argument flared, another figure appeared at the door. This time, it wasn't a quiet presence. It wasn't hesitant. It was forceful. Prince William. Now stop for a second. Can you picture the storm brewing? Charles, Anne, Harry, and now William, walking in on the very scene that confirmed his darkest suspicions. His brother, caught in the act. His aunt standing guard. His father broken, silent, demanding answers. William's reaction was nothing like Charles's. No hesitation. No silence. The moment his eyes landed on Harry, his fury erupted. He shouted, accused, through words like daggers. Years of resentment, years of betrayal, all boiling over in one volcanic moment. And Harry, cornered, desperate, shouted back. For the first time, the two brothers faced each other not as estranged family members, but as open enemies. Their words weren't whispers anymore. They were roars echoing off Windsor's ancient walls. And tried to interject. Charles tried to calm them. But the storm had broken. William accused Harry of attempting to rewrite history, to rob the family of their rightful legacy. Harry, red-faced, fired back, accusing William of always being the favorite, of hoarding power, of leaving him nothing but scraps. The brothers were no longer princes in that moment. They were wounded men, locked in a battle that went far deeper than inheritance. This was about love, about trust, about betrayal. And neither was willing to back down. The shouting grew louder. Papers scattered across the desk. Harry's hands waving, William stepping closer, fists clenched. Charles's voice trembling, trying to hold them back. And sharp tone cutting through, demanding silence. But silence never came. Not then. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end of the confrontation. This was only the beginning. And what William was about to say next would not just rip the family apart. It would shatter the illusion of reconciliation forever. What could William possibly say that would make the entire room freeze? That would take this already explosive confrontation and turn it into something far darker? That's the moment we pick up from. The shouting, the chaos, the clash of brothers, father, and aunt, all swirling together like a storm with no eye. And then William, face flushed with anger, voice trembling not from weakness but from barely contained fury, let loose words that would echo far beyond those castle walls. He accused Harry of trying to erase him from their grandmother's legacy. Let that sink in for a moment. Not just meddling with money, not just sneaking around out of curiosity, but attempting to strike William himself out of the Queen's final wishes. Can you imagine the weight of those words? Harry staggered back as if struck. The room fell silent. Even Charles looked stunned, as if William had said out loud the one fear none of them dared to whisper. Did Harry truly intend to rewrite history, to reshape Elizabeth's will so that his older brother's role, his privileges, his inheritance, would be diminished? Or was this just William's rage spilling over, sharpening his accusations into daggers designed to pierce the deepest? And here's where the contradictions make this story irresistible. Harry had always played the role of the overlooked spare, the one pushed aside while William stood tall as air. His grievances were real, his wounds genuine. But here he was, standing over papers that represented the ultimate symbol of legacy and succession. If he wasn't trying to erase William, why be there at all? If it was merely about protecting Meghan and his children, why not ask openly? Why sneak in like a thief in the night? Anne's face said it all. She didn't believe Harry. She didn't believe his excuses, his defenses. She looked at him with an expression that combined fury, disgust, and something even worse, disappointment. For Anne, duty is everything. Loyalty is sacred. And to betray the will of a monarch, to attempt to tamper with the Queen's last words, that was a sin beyond forgiveness. Charles, on the other hand, was a man split in two. One half of him was the king, the defender of monarchy, the custodian of his mother's legacy. That half saw Harry as a traitor, a threat, a wound to the institution he now bore alone. But the other half? The father, the man who once held Harry's hand, who once laughed at his jokes, who once wept when Diana was lost and promised to protect his boys. That half wanted to believe Harry, wanted to cling to the faint hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that his son hadn't crossed the line of no return. But William wasn't having it. He stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Harry's chest. His voice shook the air, accusing him of greed, of cowardice, of trying to undo the natural order that had been written not just in a will, but in blood, history, and divine right. And Harry? He snapped. He shouted back that William had always been the favorite, that everything had always been about the heir, never the spare, that their mother, Diana, would be horrified to see how William had become exactly what he swore he never would be: cold, calculating, ruthless, more crown than brother. Can you imagine the sting of those words? To invoke Diana, the mother they both adored, as a weapon in this fight? It was salt in wounds that had never healed. The brothers stood inches apart, fists clenched, their father's voice lost in the roar, and sharp commands drowned in the storm. This wasn't just an argument. This was decades of pain erupting in one volcanic moment. But here's where it gets even more compelling. In his desperation, Harry revealed something, a secret he had been carrying. He claimed there was a clause in the will, one that he had discovered in those papers before and walked in, a clause that shocked even him. A clause that would affect not just his children, but William's as well. Now let me ask you, was that true? Did such a clause exist? Or was Harry bluffing, trying to turn the tables, to make himself look like the protector rather than the saboteur? No one knew for certain in that moment. But what mattered was the impact. William froze. Charles's eyes widened. Anne's grip on her fury tightened. Because if Harry wasn't lying, then the Queen's will held secrets far more explosive than anyone had dared imagine. And yet, even that wasn't enough to cool the flames. William accused him of fabricating lies to cover his tracks. Harry accused William of wanting to silence him forever. Back and forth, accusation after accusation, their voices so loud the very walls seemed to tremble with history repeating itself. And through it all, Charles stood in agony. The king torn between two sons, his crown heavy, his heart heavier still. He had hoped for reconciliation. He had hoped for peace. Instead, he was watching the monarchy fracture before his very eyes, his mother's legacy tarnished in the shadow of betrayal. And finally stepped between them, her presence once again the immovable force. She demanded silence. She demanded respect for the Queen's memory. But even Anne, unshakable as she was, knew this was beyond control. The damage was done. The words had been spoken, and there was no undoing them. But just when the shouting reached its fever pitch, something else happened. Something that would push this confrontation to an even higher level. Because outside those walls, beyond the locked doors and hushed corridors of Windsor, another storm was brewing. Whispers, leaks. Someone, somehow, had tipped off the press that something was happening inside the castle. And by morning, the scandal would no longer belong to the family alone. It would belong to the world. Have you ever seen a secret so carefully guarded, so fiercely locked away, spill into the open with the force of a tidal wave? That's exactly what happened when whispers of Harry's confrontation with Anne, Charles, and William began to leak beyond the walls of Windsor. Imagine it, the royal family still reeling from a night of shouting, accusations, and raw betrayal. And yet, Before they could even take a breath, before they could close ranks and patch over the cracks, the press already knew something was brewing. But how? Who spoke? And why so fast? Here's where the story twists into something even more sinister. The royal family has always prided itself on discretion. Never complain, never explain. That was Elizabeth's golden rule. But in the age of social media, picture the morning after. London waking up to headlines splashed across front pages, hinting at chaos behind Windsor's gates. No details yet, just enough to stir curiosity, enough to light a fire. Late-night family row. Heated confrontation over Queen's legacy. Palace insiders tight-lipped. That was all it took for the speculation machine to roar into life. Now pause. Ask yourself, who leaked it? Was it a palace aide, tired of secrecy, eager to cash in on the juiciest scoop of the decade? Was it a journalist's mole, slipping details for money or power? Or, and this is where things get dark, was it someone inside the family itself, determined to frame the narrative before the truth fully emerged? Because timing matters. And these whispers didn't come days later. They came within hours. That means whoever leaked it wanted the world to know before the dust had even settled inside the castle. That's not carelessness, that's strategy. And the effect? Explosive. By midday, broadcasters across the UK and beyond were running with the story. CNN, BBC, Sky News. Headlines grew bolder with each hour. What had been whispers became claims. What had been speculation hardened into sources confirm. And the public? Oh, the public was hooked. Twitter lit up. Hashtags trended worldwide. Memes flooded Instagram. Everyone wanted to know, what had Harry done now? For many, it was confirmation of their worst suspicions. They had long believed Harry and Meghan to be opportunists, grasping at money and fame while tearing down the monarchy. For others, it was proof that the palace was out to destroy him, framing him yet again as the villain while silencing his side of the story. Lines were drawn. Opinions clashed. And the royal family, already fragile, found itself in the eye of a storm it could no longer control. Inside Windsor, chaos reigned. Royal aides scrambled. Phones rang nonstop. Advisors begged the king to release a statement, to get ahead of the narrative. But Charles hesitated. Silence had always been the family's shield, but silence now looked like guilt. Still, what could he say? Admit that Harry had been caught near the Queen's will? That would confirm the very scandal he wanted to bury. Deny it? That risked the truth spilling out anyway, exposing them as liars. This is the trap of monarchy in the modern age. For centuries, secrecy worked. But now, in a world where leaks travel at the speed of light, where public trust is already brittle, silence isn't safety. It's gasoline poured onto fire. And then came the morning papers. The Daily Mail ran with it first. Harry in midnight bust up at Windsor. The Sun followed. Willgate, Prince caught in shock clash. The Guardian, more restrained but no less devastating. Tensions flare over Queen's legacy. And once those headlines hit breakfast tables, there was no going back. The scandal was out. Now think about what this means for the family dynamics. Harry wasn't just caught by Charles and William. He was caught by the world. His private humiliation became public fodder overnight. And if you know Harry, you know this is his greatest nightmare and his greatest weapon. He hates the press, blames them for Diana's death, despises their intrusion. Yet, when cornered, he has often used the media to flip the script, to cast himself as the wrong party. Would he do it again? Would Meghan? Almost certainly. And that's where the contradictions get sharper. Because while the palace scrambled to contain the flames, Harry and Meghan's team in California saw opportunity. Within hours, allies of the Sussexes began hinting to friendly journalists that Harry was being smeared again, that he had stumbled upon shocking provisions in the Queen's will, provisions that justified his alarm, that he wasn't tampering, he was protecting his wife, protecting his children, protecting the truth. But was that true? Or was it spin? Here's the irony. Both sides believed they were defending the Queen's legacy. And Charles and William believed Harry had desecrated it by sneaking into a room he had no right to enter. Harry believed he was honoring it, ensuring Meghan and the children weren't erased from history. Two clashing truths, both unshakable, both irreconcilable. And the public, hungry for drama, devoured every word. Let's not forget the emotional toll on Charles. Imagine being king for barely a year, still grieving your mother, and now forced to watch your sons rip each other apart in the press. His reign, meant to symbolize stability, was now branded by chaos. Could he trust Harry ever again? Could he even trust his own household, knowing someone had leaked the confrontation before the king himself had decided how to respond? And then there's William. For him, this wasn't just scandal. This was war. He had watched his brother accuse him on television, in memoirs, in interviews. He had remained silent, maintaining the dignity expected of a future king. But this was personal. This was Harry reaching into the Queen's will, William's inheritance, William's duty, William's future. If reconciliation had been difficult before, it was now impossible. Meanwhile, Anne remained the iron spine of the family. In public, she said nothing. But behind closed doors, she insisted that Harry face consequences. She told Charles bluntly that the monarchy couldn't survive if they allowed betrayal to go unchecked. Her words carried weight, because if Anne, respected and unflinching, was calling for punishment, how could Charles ignore it? The palace tried to hold the line. No comment, they told reporters. Family matters, they said. But silence didn't cool the fire. It fueled it. Rumors flourished. Speculation grew darker. Some claimed Harry had tried to physically remove pages. Others said he had been caught copying contents on his phone. None of it was confirmed. But in the court of public opinion, confirmation hardly mattered. Perception was everything. And the perception was this: Harry had gone too far. But here's where the real cliffhanger emerges. Because just as the palace was drowning in headlines, just as Charles was ready to make a decision, new information came to light. A revelation about the will itself. Something so shocking, so destabilizing, that it threatened to turn the scandal upside down. And that revelation? It would prove that the Queen's final wishes were even more controversial than anyone had imagined. What could be written in Queen Elizabeth's will that was so shocking, so destabilizing, it could tear apart the family even more than Harry's alleged tampering? That's the question that began to gnaw at both the palace and the public once whispers of hidden provisions surfaced. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because if what Harry claimed was true, then the Queen may have left behind instructions that directly undermined the stability of the monarchy itself. Let's set the stage. Royal wills, by tradition, are sealed. No one outside a very tight circle ever sees them. They are not debated in courts, not discussed in parliaments, not printed in newspapers. But leaks have a way of slithering through cracks, and this time, the leak wasn't about the confrontation, it was about the will itself. Someone whispered that there was indeed a clause concerning Harry, Meghan, and the children. And not just a token mention, not a passing line. A clause with real implications. According to whispers that began to surface in certain press circles, the Queen had included a provision protecting Archie and Lilibet's royal titles, ensuring that no matter what happened with Harry and Meghan, the children would always remain of the blood. That's not just sentiment, that's dynastic strategy. Because while Harry and Meghan had distanced themselves, the Queen, it seemed, had wanted to shield the children from being erased from history. Now think about what that means. For Harry, it was vindication. Proof, he would claim, that his mother's wishes aligned with his desperate defense of his family. For William and Anne, it was betrayal. Because how could the Queen, the most careful, most deliberate monarch of modern history, reward the very son who had fled the monarchy and sold its secrets? But here's the twist. Alongside that clause was another, one even more dangerous. A clause concerning Meghan herself. The rumor was that the Queen had specifically excluded Meghan from certain trusts, estates, and inheritances, making clear that while the children were to be protected, Meghan herself was not to benefit directly from the crown's assets. Can you see the contradiction? On one hand, she safeguarded the children. On the other, she drew a hard line against their mother. A grandmother's love mixed with a monarch's caution, tenderness intertwined with steel. And this contradiction was dynamite, because it meant that both sides of the family could claim victory, and both could claim betrayal. Harry could argue that the Queen had defended his children's legacy, justifying his desperation to access the will. William and Anne could argue that Meghan's exclusion proved the Queen saw through her, that Harry's obsession with the will was about money and power, not protection. The leak electrified the media. Talk shows debated it endlessly. Was it true? Was it palace spin? Was Harry lying to shield himself? No one could prove it, and yet the whispers carried the weight of truth because they were just plausible enough to fit the Queen's character. After all, Elizabeth was a monarch who understood both duty and family. Would it surprise anyone that she drew the line where Meghan was concerned, while still safeguarding innocent grandchildren? But inside Windsor, the revelation landed like a bomb. William confronted Harry again, this time in front of Charles and Anne, demanding to know exactly what he had seen in the papers. Harry swore he wasn't lying, that he had seen it with his own eyes, and dismissed it as manipulation. Charles, pale and weary, asked the one question no one else dared to. If this was true, why had Harry chosen secrecy? Why sneak? Why not trust his family to reveal it in time? Harry's answer was simple, desperate, and devastating. Because I don't trust you. Can you imagine how those words landed? To look your father in the eye, your father who is king, and tell him you cannot trust him to honor the Queen's wishes? It was more than rebellion. It was an earthquake. And here's where the public contradiction deepened. Because while Harry insisted he was fighting for his children's rightful place, William countered with an accusation that cut even deeper. He accused Harry of planning to use the clause about Archie and Lilibet as a weapon, not to protect them, but to demand money, status, and influence for himself and Meghan. Think about that for a second. If William was right, then Harry wasn't the guardian of his children's future. He was the exploiter of it. And that, to the public, was unforgivable. Meanwhile, Anne pressed Charles for decisive action. She argued that the monarchy could not afford to let this scandal linger, that silence, hesitation, or leniency would look like weakness. And Charles? He wavered, as always, torn between blood and crown, between father and king. He knew and was right, but his heart was shackled to his son. And while the family tore itself apart inside, the outside world grew louder, harsher, more demanding. Demonstrators appeared outside Buckingham Palace with signs, "Protect the crown" on one side, "Justice for Harry" on the other. Social media split into camps, hashtags trending with each accusation, each new leak. But the real storm was yet to come. Because if the Queen's will truly contain such explosive provisions, then why stop at whispers? Why not let the world see the truth for itself? And that's exactly what was about to happen. Because somewhere, somehow, a fragment of the will, one page, one photograph line, was about to be leaked. And once it reached the press, there would be no denying it. What happens when the one thing you've sworn to protect, the very secret you built your reputation on, slips out into the public eye? That was the nightmare the monarchy faced when, against all odds, a fragment of Queen Elizabeth's will found its way into the hands of the press. Not speculation, not rumor, not whispers from shadowy palace insiders. A tangible leak, a photograph line, a piece of paper that should never, under any circumstances, have left Windsor's vaults. And the line? It was enough to send shockwaves across the world. Enough to make believers out of doubters. Enough to prove that at least part of Harry's claims were real. The clause regarding Archie and Lilibet's titles appeared before the public. A sentence affirming that the children of the Duke of Sussex shall retain rights of style and dignity, unencumbered by circumstance or geography. Read that again. Unencumbered by circumstance or geography. What did that mean? That even if Harry chose to live in America, even if he renounced royal duties, his children would not lose their claim. It was protection. It was a shield. It was the Queen's last safeguard for two small children who had been born into chaos. But here's where it gets murky. The fragment ended there. No one knew what came after. No one knew what other conditions, exclusions, or limitations might have been written beyond that line. That single sentence was ripped from context, blasted across the front pages of every major paper in Britain, dissected on television screens in America, debated endlessly online. For Harry, it was vindication. He pointed to it as proof that he had not lied, that his presence in that room was not an act of theft but an act of defense. He told allies that he had only wanted to ensure his grandmother's wishes were respected, that he had feared the palace might bury this clause, strip his children quietly, erase them from history. But William and Anne saw it differently. They argued that Harry's very act of sneaking into the archives undermined the will's sanctity, that he had tainted it, turned it into a weapon, corrupted the Queen's final words with his desperation. And the leak? To them, The leak was confirmation that Harry had been reckless enough, or manipulative enough, to let private documents fall into public hands. Now here's the contradiction you can't ignore. The palace swore that the vaults were secure, that the will had never been compromised. And yet the leak was real. So where did it come from? Did Harry himself snap that photo, either in the heat of the moment or in a calculated bid to protect himself later? Or was it someone else, an insider aide, a clerk, someone with access who decided to cash in on history? The question of the leak became just as explosive as the clause itself. Because if Harry had done it, then he wasn't just a desperate grandson, he was an active saboteur. If someone else had done it, then Windsor wasn't just fractured, it was compromised, bleeding from within. And the world devoured it. Talk shows debated endlessly. Was the Queen subtly rebuking Charles by protecting Harry's children regardless of geography? Was she undermining William's future reign by ensuring the Sussex line remained untouchable? Or was it nothing more than a grandmother's love? Misinterpreted, blown out of proportion, and weaponized by her feuding heirs? Meanwhile, inside the palace, fury erupted. Charles was incandescent, though not at Harry alone. He demanded answers from his aides, from his staff, from every corner of the institution. How had this happened? Who had betrayed the secrecy his mother had valued so fiercely? Was Harry guilty, or was the palace leaking against itself? The paranoia was palpable. No one trusted anyone. Every aide became a suspect. Every whisper became a dagger, and was relentless. She pressed Charles to take immediate action against Harry. She argued that the monarchy's credibility was at stake. If you let this slide, she reportedly told him, then we are no better than a circus. And she wasn't wrong. Because from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. A circus, a family feud spilling onto global headlines, their sacred traditions exposed for public entertainment. But Harry wasn't finished. He countered by suggesting that the leak hadn't come from him at all, but from inside the palace, deliberately designed to smear him while confirming just enough of his story to fuel scandal. Think about that. Harry flipping the accusation, pointing the finger not at himself, but at the very institution trying to crush him. Can you see the trap this created? If the palace denied it, the public would assume they were hiding something. If they admitted it, then they had to reveal more. Either way, trust was shattered. And Meghan? From California, she played her part carefully. She didn't speak directly, but her allies did. They painted the Queen's clause as proof that Elizabeth loved Archie and Lilibet, that she had seen through the pettiness of the palace, that she had ensured her great-grandchildren would not pay the price for their parents' choices. Meghan's camp spun it as love triumphing over politics, but critics called it something else. Opportunism, twisting a grandmother's dying words into a narrative of martyrdom. Now let's talk about the public reaction, because this is where things get truly fascinating. Some rallied behind Harry, saying the Queen's will showed she had wanted him and his family to remain central, no matter what. Others rallied behind William, insisting that Harry's actions tainted the very words he claimed to defend. And then there were those who asked the most dangerous question of all. If one clause could leak, what else was in the will? What other secrets lay buried? The pressure on Charles grew unbearable. For a king still trying to establish his authority, still trying to step out of his mother's shadow, this was catastrophic. His reign was supposed to be about stability, continuity, modernization. Instead, it was about scandal, betrayal, and suspicion. And here's where the cruel irony lies. The Queen had sealed her will precisely to avoid this chaos. To stop her family from tearing itself apart over money, titles, and legacy. And yet, her secrecy had achieved the opposite. Because the unknown invites speculation, and speculation invites disaster. Inside Windsor, the shouting matches resumed. William accused Harry of orchestrating the leak. Harry swore he hadn't, and demanded consequences. Charles begged for restraint. It was the same storm, replaying again and again, but each time louder, harsher, more destructive. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Because while the world was still digesting the clause about Archie and Lilibet, another leak appeared. Another fragment. Another line. Darker and more devastating than the first. This one wasn't about the children. It was about Meghan. What happens when love collides head-on with legacy? That was the question hanging in the air when the second fragment of Queen Elizabeth's will surfaced. The first leak had stunned the world, showing her commitment to Archie and Lilibet's titles. But this one was different. This one wasn't about innocent children. This one was about Meghan. And the words were brutal. The leaked clause reportedly stated, "No provision shall be made for the Duchess of Sussex in the disposition of private estates or trusts, save for items of sentimental value to be directed at Her Majesty's discretion." Let that sink in. No provision shall be made. A cold, clinical phrase that rang like a gavel strike. Meghan, the woman who had married into the royal family, the woman who bore two. Now ask yourself, why would the Queen, renowned for her sense of duty, for her ability to separate personal feelings from institutional responsibility, make such a decision? Was it mistrust? Was it disappointment? Or was it pragmatism, ensuring that royal wealth and estates stayed within bloodlines rather than flowing to outsiders? For Meghan's critics, it was vindication. Proof, they said, that Elizabeth had seen through her, that she had recognized the dangers of Meghan's ambition, her hunger for influence, her willingness to drag the monarchy into the spotlight of Hollywood. To them, the Queen's exclusion wasn't cruelty, it was wisdom. But for Meghan's supporters, it was cruelty of the highest order. How could the Queen, they argued, punish a woman simply for being an outsider? How could she cut Meghan off while safeguarding everyone else? They saw it as the final rejection, a reminder that no matter how much Meghan gave, she would never truly belong. And for Harry? This was the ultimate humiliation, because the Queen had protected his children but frozen out his wife, the woman he had sacrificed everything for, the woman he had abandoned royal duty for, the woman he had defended in interviews, memoirs, and documentaries. To see her name carved out of the Queen's legacy must have felt like a dagger plunged into his heart. Imagine the contradictions racing through his mind. On one hand, vindication, his children's place was secure. On the other, devastation. His wife's rejection was now carved in royal ink. And the public? They didn't hesitate to exploit it. Memes flooded the internet. Headlines screamed, "Meghan cut out." Queen's final verdict on Duchess. Talk show hosts debated whether Elizabeth had been justified or vindictive. Meghan, whether she liked it or not, was now branded as the woman whom the Queen had chosen to exclude. Inside Windsor, the fallout was immediate. William seized on the clause, declaring it proof that Harry had been lying all along. If the Queen trusted Meghan so little, he reportedly said, then Harry's obsession with the will wasn't about protection. It was about desperation. And nodded in agreement, her voice cold, her judgment final. To her, Meghan had always been a risk, a disruption to the family's stability. The Queen's words only confirmed it. But Charles, his reaction was far more complicated. Because while he couldn't deny the clause, while he couldn't erase the ink of his mother's decision, he also knew the impact it would have on Harry. He saw the storm in his son's eyes, the mix of rage, grief, and despair. As king, he was bound to uphold the will. As father, he wanted to soothe the wound. But how do you do both without tearing yourself in two? And Meghan herself? From California, her silence was deafening. She did not issue a statement, but those close to her painted the picture of a woman devastated, humiliated, and furious. Some said she wept. Others said she raged, pacing her Montecito estate, demanding to know how much more she would be forced to endure from a family that had never welcomed her. Allies of Meghan whispered that the exclusion was racist, that it was punishment for daring to marry into the firm while not fitting their mold. But there was another interpretation, one darker still. Some argued that the Queen hadn't excluded Meghan out of malice, but out of foresight, that she feared Meghan might use inherited assets to strengthen her own brand, her own empire, independent of the monarchy, that she had acted not out of personal spite, but institutional preservation. Which side do you believe? Was Elizabeth a grandmother protecting her family's legacy, or a monarch delivering one final blow to a daughter-in-law she never trusted? The debate raged in public, but inside the family, it tore the last threads of reconciliation apart. Harry erupted at William, insisting that the Queen's exclusion of Meghan didn't justify their hostility, that she had still safeguarded his children, and that this was what mattered most. William fired back, accusing Harry of twisting their grandmother's words to suit his narrative, and, ever unflinching, declared that the Queen had spoken clearly. Meghan was not to be trusted, and Harry had chosen her over the family. Charles, trapped in the middle, begged for calm. But calm was impossible. Not when every headline screamed about Meghan's exclusion. Not when every talk show pitted Team Meghan against Team Monarchy. Not when every social media thread was a battlefield of insults, accusations, and conspiracy theories. And then came the cruelest twist of all. Because just as Harry was reeling from the blow of Meghan's exclusion, just as the palace was trying to contain the firestorm, another leak emerged. A whisper that the will didn't just name Meghan an exclusion. It contained a line about Harry himself. And that line, if revealed, would not only shatter what little dignity he had left, it would call into question his very place in the monarchy. What happens when the very foundation of your identity, the name, the bloodline, the crown you've built your entire life around, is suddenly called into question? That was the unthinkable cliffhanger dangling over Harry's head when whispers spread that the Queen's will didn't just exclude Meghan. It contained a line about Harry himself, a line so brutal, so final, it risked erasing him not just from inheritance, but from the monarchy's very story. The leak was vague at first. A palace insider, speaking under the cloak of anonymity, hinted that the Queen had written something about Harry's position in relation to the monarchy. But the wording was unclear. Some said it was a reaffirmation that he had stepped away, that he was no longer to be considered a working royal. Others claimed it went further, that Elizabeth had stripped him of any claim beyond the blood that flowed in his veins. Now imagine the panic that rippled through the palace as this rumor spread. One clause about Archie and Lilibet was already explosive. One clause about Meghan was devastating. But a clause about Harry? That was nuclear. Because if true, it wasn't just a matter of exclusion. It was a declaration. A statement from the Queen herself that her grandson, the boy she had once doted on, the man she had once shielded, was no longer worthy of her legacy. Can you even fathom the humiliation, the rage, the heartbreak? Harry's defenders clung to the hope that the leak was exaggerated. They said Elizabeth would never have disowned him in such a way, no matter how disappointed she had been in his choices. They argued that she had always loved him too much, that she had tried to protect him from the worst of royal scrutiny. But others pointed to her steely pragmatism. This was the woman who had weathered abdication, divorces, scandals, and betrayals. When the crown was at stake, Elizabeth put duty above all else, even family. Would it really surprise anyone if she had done the same with Harry? Inside Windsor, the tension was unbearable. William, already seething, seized on the rumor as proof that Harry's actions were out of line. "She saw through you," he reportedly told his brother. "She knew exactly who you had become," and backed him, her words like iron, reminding Harry that loyalty is earned, not demanded. But Harry wasn't silent. He exploded. He shouted that the Queen had been manipulated, that palace courtiers had poisoned her against him, that her words in the will didn't reflect her true feelings. He swore that she had loved him to the end, that she had adored Meghan, that she had wanted nothing more than unity for the family. Do you see the contradiction here? On one side, a grandson insisting his grandmother's true love had been twisted by the institution. On the other, a family insisting the Queen had spoken for herself, in her own deliberate hand, with her own deliberate will. Which do you believe? The public was split. Some wept at the thought of Harry being so coldly cut off. Others cheered, seeing it as long overdue justice for years of betrayal. Social media raged. Talk shows dissected every possibility. Was Harry truly erased? Or was the clause simply a clarification of his choice to step away? And then, the second leak hit. This time, it wasn't just a sentence, it was a paragraph. A photograph page, passed anonymously to a tabloid, that sent shockwaves through the world. It read, "It is my wish that the Duke of Sussex, having chosen a path separate from the duties of this family, shall not be considered in matters of succession, inheritance of estate, or representation of the crown. His life is his own to pursue, free from obligation, but also free from entitlement." Read that again. Shall not be considered. Not just excluded from estates. Not just stripped of duties. Not just sidelined. Declared irrelevant. Written out. For Harry, it was annihilation. A public execution of identity, carried out in ink by the woman who had once been his greatest protector. Can you imagine what went through his mind reading those words? Anger, surely. Betrayal, no doubt. But also grief. Because in that moment, The narrative he had clung to, that he was the wounded party, that he was the victim of palace cruelty, collapsed. His grandmother's will didn't portray him as a victim. It portrayed him as someone who had walked away and who no longer deserved the privileges he had abandoned. William's reaction was instant and vicious. He declared that the Queen had spoken clearly, that there was no more debate. She chose the monarchy over you, he spat. And so will we. And stood by him, her expression as unflinching as ever. To her, this was closure. A painful truth, yes, but a truth that needed to be faced. But Charles? For Charles, it was devastation. His mother's words were now public, immortalized, beyond denial. And he, as king, had to enforce them. Yet he looked at Harry, not as a traitor, not as an exile, but as his son, his blood, his boy. How could he bring himself to drive the knife deeper when Elizabeth's will had already cut so deep? And Meghan? Her fury was volcanic. Friends of hers whispered that she saw the clause as proof of institutional racism, as punishment for daring to challenge the firm. She reportedly told allies that Harry had been targeted not for his choices, but for his love for her. And while her defenders rallied behind that claim, her critics saw it as more spin, another attempt to turn humiliation into martyrdom. The contradictions only deepened. Was Harry the grandson betrayed by a cold institution? Or was he the prince who betrayed the institution and reaped the consequences? Was the Queen cruel in her exclusion, or pragmatic in her defense of the monarchy? But one thing was certain. The leak had made reconciliation impossible. The words were out. They could not be denied. They could not be erased. And yet, even this wasn't the end. Because buried within the will, beyond the clauses about Meghan, about Harry, about Archie and Lilibet, was something even more dangerous. A secret no one had anticipated. A line not about exclusion, but about revelation. A line that hinted at something the Queen had carried silently for decades. And when that secret came to light, it would shake not just the royal family, but the very history of the monarchy itself. What secret could Queen Elizabeth possibly have carried to her grave, so powerful, so earth-shattering, that she felt compelled to put it in writing, hidden within the sealed chambers of her final will? That's the cliffhanger we now face. Because this wasn't about money. It wasn't about jewels, estates, or titles. This was about truth. A truth that, if fully revealed, could rewrite the very history of the monarchy. The fragment that surfaced wasn't long, just a few lines. But its implications were staggering. The Queen had written, "It is my earnest hope that matters long buried, though painful, shall one day be acknowledged with candor for the health of this family and the nation it serves." Now think about that. Matters long buried. What matters? What secrets? What truths had Elizabeth kept locked behind her famously inscrutable smile? Was this about Charles's marriage to Diana and Camilla? Was it about Andrew and his scandals? Or was it about something even deeper, more dangerous, something that touched the very question of bloodlines and legitimacy? Theories exploded the moment those words hit the press. Some commentators insisted the Queen was hinting at unresolved pain over Diana, an acknowledgement that the institution had mishandled her, that the monarchy had failed to protect the woman who was supposed to be its jewel. Others speculated she was referring to Andrew, the scandal no one dared to speak of in polite company, the disgrace that had stained her later years. But the most explosive interpretation? That it was about Harry himself. Could the Queen have been hinting at a buried truth about his place in the family? About his bloodline? About whispers that had haunted tabloids for decades? That Harry might not be Charles's son? These rumors, always dismissed as cruel speculation, suddenly gained terrifying traction in the shadow of the will. After all, why else would she include such a cryptic line about matters long buried? And here's the contradiction. The Queen had spent her entire reign mastering silence. She never revealed her thoughts, her opinions, her private truths. And yet, in her final document, she had left a tantalizing breadcrumb. Why? Was it intentional, a warning to her heirs that lies can't last forever? Or was it accidental, a vague sentiment misunderstood and weaponized by those hungry for scandal? Inside Windsor, the fallout was immediate. Harry seized on the line, insisting it proved his grandmother had wanted transparency. She wanted the truth out, he allegedly told aides. She didn't want things hidden anymore. To him, It was proof that the monarchy had conspired for too long to bury secrets that were destroying them from within. William, by contrast, was livid. He saw it as dangerous ambiguity, a line that would fuel endless conspiracy theories and tarnish the family's image. She wanted dignity, he argued, not spectacle, not gossip, and agreed, calling Harry's interpretation self-serving. For her, the line was nothing more than a generic appeal to honesty, not a bombshell, not a revelation. But Charles? Charles was shaken, because if anyone knew what matters long buried might mean, it was him. And his silence in the face of the leak only fueled speculation. Did he know something the rest of the world didn't? Did Elizabeth confide in him before her death, warning him of what might come if the truth ever surfaced? Meanwhile, the press went wild. Talk shows debated whether the Queen had been subtly admitting to failures. Tabloids ran headlines asking whether the line was about Diana or Harry's paternity. Social media exploded with theories, memes, and heated arguments. And through it all, the monarchy's credibility cracked under the weight of unanswered questions. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, what would be worse? That the Queen had left a vague, open-ended line that cast shadows over her family without explanation? Or that she had been deliberately hinting at a scandal so big it could bring the monarchy to its knees? Either possibility is devastating. For Harry, this became ammunition. He doubled down on his claims that he had been treated unfairly, that secrets had poisoned his life, that his family had manipulated the truth for decades. He painted himself as the victim of those long-buried matters, the one who had suffered most from the monarchy's lies. For William, it was infuriating. He believed Harry was twisting their grandmother's words, exploiting her memory to justify his own rebellion. And he said as much, reportedly confronting Harry in a shouting match that ended with the brothers once again inches from blows, and urged Charles to act, to shut down the narrative before it spun further out of control. But Charles hesitated, because the truth was, he didn't know how to contain it. Every denial only fueled speculation. Every silence looked like guilt. Every word, every action, risked confirming what no one dared to say out loud. And here's where the irony bites. The Queen had sealed her will to protect her family from scandal. Yet in doing so, she had created the perfect storm of suspicion. A single vague line had unleashed a whirlwind of theories, accusations, and divisions that no one could control. The public was hooked. Polls showed declining trust in the monarchy. Commentators asked whether it was time for transparency. Activists demanded the full will be released. And Harry? He fed the fire, giving cryptic comments through allies, hinting that he knew more than he could say. But the truth was, the Queen's words were still just a fragment, a sentence without context. And the rest of that section of the will remained hidden. What else did she write? What matters was she referring to? Were they truly about Diana? About Andrew? About Harry's legitimacy? Or was it something even darker, something no one had yet considered? The answer, hidden in those locked vaults, threatened to destroy everything. And just when the family thought it couldn't get any worse, another leak emerged. Not from the will this time, but from someone who claimed to have heard the Queen speak of those matters long buried in her final days. And that testimony, when revealed, would ignite the most dangerous scandal yet. What happens when a voice from the shadows suddenly steps forward, claiming to have heard the Queen herself whisper the truth that everyone else has spent years denying? That's where this story now turns. Because if the will's cryptic line about matters long buried had cracked the monarchy's facade, the testimony that followed threatened to blow it wide open. The source wasn't a tabloid journalist or a palace aide looking to make a quick fortune. It was someone far closer. A nurse. A woman who had tended to Queen Elizabeth in her final months. A figure whose presence was so routine, so trusted, that her words carried an authenticity others lacked. She didn't sell her story to a tabloid. She shared it quietly, almost reluctantly, with a confidant who then leaked it. And what she revealed was stunning. According to her, in the quiet hours of her final days, the Queen often spoke about regret. Not about her reign, not about her duty, but about her family. She confided that there were truths she had carried silently, truths that, if revealed, would tear the family apart, but if buried forever, would poison the monarchy from within. And the nurse claimed she heard the Queen say, with unmistakable clarity, "They will never forgive me for what I hid. But one day it must come out." Now pause and let that sink in. What I hid. What could Elizabeth have possibly hidden that weighed so heavily on her conscience? Theories immediately spiraled. Some argued she was referring to her handling of Diana, that she had suppressed the full truth of how isolated and abandoned Diana felt. Others said it was about Andrew, that she had shielded him far longer than she should have, allowing scandal to fester. But the most explosive interpretation, the one that sent shockwaves around the globe, was this: that she had been alluding to Harry's place in the family, that the rumors of his paternity, dismissed for decades as cruel gossip, were not entirely baseless. Can you imagine the chaos of that suggestion? Overnight, social media lit up with side-by-side photos of Harry and James Hewitt, the cavalry officer long rumored to be Diane.